Good evening. I hope you all had a magical adventure this weekend and that you're stoked to head into another week of micro. And on Tuesday, we will be beginning our ecology, our very, very short ecology section in the lab. And I thought it would be great to share with you for this last week of September, an article that is perhaps just reaffirming to most of us. I think we are all familiar with the negatives of nitrate contamination of marine environments. And remember that those nitrates are coming from a lot of industrial processes, that is the excessive fertilization of a lot of agricultural lands. Nitrates leach into the water and can eventually hit very high concentrations in marine environments, and they fuel and feed the growth of algae. And this is a study that is showing a tight link between the increased algal populations and the decline of coral reefs. So this is a fun Science Daily article that might add a little bit of background or maybe just give you something to think about as we head into Lab 7 this week. So let's pull up the schedule and talk just a bit about what we have coming. Lab 7 will be maybe a little bit more laid back than some of the labs, but it also is a big day in terms of submissions. They'll be turning in their unknown press releases on the day, which in terms of grading, it's quite minimal, but they'll also be submitting their pipetteman tutorial on that exact same day. So since all of you have at least 2 TAs in the lab at this point, I would suggest that you go ahead and split the jobs on these, because really neither one of them is very much of a burden. So even if you're an unpaid TA, perhaps maybe you want to get your experience going on this grading, because both are fairly enjoyable to grade and they're very, very quick to grade. So we'll try to split that grading up, make it easier. Also remember that on your TA CD, there is a grading key for the unknown press release. So the students do not need to submit page 35 of their lab manual for your purposes of grading. You do have an additional grading key on there, and you can go ahead and print out that rubric, so to speak, and use that and tack that onto the unknown press releases if you would like to. Likewise, you can also just indicate, because the point distribution for that is very straightforward, and it is listed for them on page 35. So that's going to be a big thing of submissions this week. Also, I wanted to point out that Amy, Sarah, and James, you're going to be in open lab this week. We're also going to be working on Lab 8, so we'll be looking at the antibiotics in that section, the Kirby-Bauer assay, as well as the antibiotic resistance, selection for antibiotic resistance, and UV light. So Lab 8, while it's not a complex lab, it is busy. There's a lot of things going on, and in fact, one of the things that we need to keep in mind for Lab 8 is to split the groups up so that each bench starts with something different, so that none of any given station doesn't become a clusterfuck, right? We got to make sure that things go smoothly, and excuse my French. So let's go ahead and look a little bit at each one of those labs and the TA guidelines for each one, beginning with Lab 7. And a couple of additional things to add for Lab 7. Before beginning today, we have a lot to write on the board, and I'll try to get all of that outlined for you, but you can help me remember to erase the results from the prior lab and get the next labs up. So the summarization of the results from the pH, the osmotic pressure, the salt and sugar, as well as the temperature, we're going to want to get those up there, and I'll lead them through a discussion on all of this. But a quick note, I do have photographs taken from each of the locations that we collected the new acidophile and the alkalophile, so we can show them those photographs prior to diving into the rest of the lecture for that day. We'll also want to make sure that each student really understands why we're restreaking the T-plate and the importance of taking only a tiny bit from a single isolated colony in the restreak process. It's a real tendency, of course, for them to want to just pull up that entire Staph aureus colony and restreak it, and if they do that, they're not going to get any isolated culture. So we need to make sure that they take just only the tiniest bit of their isolated colony, particularly if they're working with the larger Staph aureus colonies. And today it might be a good thing to go around and talk with them about the differences they're seeing between the Micrococcus luteus, which is the very tiny one, that with time will turn more and more yellow. The Staph aureus, of course, the much larger one on there. Now, I know that not all of you are going to be giving the lecture for this lab, but if you are, there's some additional information about Margaret McFall-Nye's work on the Aesculapes and Vibrio fischeri symbiotic relationship. And I've also given a link here that I've highlighted to a YouTube video. If you would like to augment your day with watching that YouTube video, we can hook up a computer to the plasma screen and we can get that done. So just let me know if that will augment it if you're giving the lecture. If I'm giving the lecture, of course, I'll choose to potentially show them that video as well. Okay, great. So in terms of Lab 7, just making sure that we're getting everything done. I think, one other thing that I did want to make sure of is that during Lab 7, I'll be taking small groups back to look at the bioluminescence, and so I'll be kind of out of the room when they're working on Pipette Men tutorials. So I would love it if one of you at least would want to run around and talk with them about particularly the question in the tutorial that asks about why you don't want to allow the pipette to snap back up, and that's just because when that happens, the liquid hops up, and of course you do get the wrong volume because of that, but it's also deleterious to the pipette man itself. The liquid can get into the mechanism, it can actually break the pipette man. Also, it can cause contamination because, of course, the tip of that pipette man is not sterile. The pipette tips are sterile, but the white part of the pipette man is not sterile. So important to go around and talk to them about that because some of them won't know how to answer that question. It's also during Lab 7, sorry, I've caught a little cold, so I'm snuffly. It's also during Lab 7 that we're going to be building the Winogradsky columns, so you'll want to make sure that we mention that to them and I would like to keep the pace of the day going. We don't need to rush, but we need to kind of keep things moving, and at the end of the day there should be time for them to build the Winogradsky columns. The other thing that sometimes happens is that they'll get to the last 15 minutes of lab and they'll think, I don't have time to build my column. That is not the case. It should only take about 5 to 10 minutes at the most to build the column. So the other thing we can do is remind them that it really won't take that much time. Okay, I think that's mostly everything for Lab 7, and I'll go ahead and pull up Lab 8 TA guidelines. This, as I said, is a more busy lab, but it's also much more straightforward as far as lecture content. Again, just covering damages from UV, covering antibiotics. A quick note on that, this will be their first complete exposure to antibiotics. We've talked a little bit about it in lecture, but we're not to our full antibiotic coverage in lecture yet. So this will be a good place for you to really get them started and get them really to the point where they can surmise a lot of the different mechanisms of action of different antibiotics. There's some great information, additional information in this TA guideline that will really help out with giving that lecture. So take some time to look at that. There's a little bit on the history of antibiotic discovery and some other things that may be helpful in terms of teaching the antibiotic resistance selection. A lot of the students understood it pretty well on the exam, but I still get a lot of this idea that antibiotics make mutants, that they lead to the creation of a superbug, and they don't. They just select for those that are already resistant, and so I think it's really important to reiterate that. Even though by now, for you guys, that seems very, very straightforward, it's something that a lot of people take a lot of time to learn. Okay, what else for Lab 8? I think that the one thing is, remember that they'll be using E. coli in different phases of growth for their Kirby-Bauer versus their streptomycin resistance. We'll be using initial log phase E. coli for the Kirby-Bauer, and we'll be using late log phase or stationary phase for the streptomycin resistance. So although I will announce this and try to write it on the board, help me to help them remember to use different E. coli for the two different experiments. Great, I think that's everything for Lab 8, and I've just realized that I wanted to go back for just a moment to the schedule because I wanted to reiterate the due date for the dilution problems and just a quick reminder that that will be on the 2nd. So it's next Tuesday, this October the 2nd. And also looking towards that week of October the 1st, I will be gone for a conference on that Friday the 5th, having to drive up to Riverton. And so Jake and John will be there for Open Lab, but I think that's Marielle and Callie. So just a FYI on that, and we can chat if there's anything we want to talk about regarding, logistics of that day. Okay, wonderful. I hope you all have an awesome Sunday night, and I can't wait to see you on Tuesday.